Hi, my name is Ben. I am not an optimist. In fact, I am a skeptic. Actually, a lot of the time I'm more like a cynic, so much so that I can really piss people off with the degree to which I'm a kind of Debbie Downer about everything. Um, I envy optimists. I sometimes wish I was an optimist. I envy their cheerful attitude about everything. But I've never been able to get over the suspicion that the power of positive thinking, so to speak, is just a excuse to lie to yourself and other people about reality. So it's never really been for me. However, on one really big topic, I am an optimist despite myself. It's honestly a little embarrassing. It doesn't really go with the rest of my personality. But when it comes to the future of the world, the fate of humanity, all that, the big picture, I am incredibly optimistic. In fact, I'm not just optimistic, I am excited. I am awestruck every day by how far we have come as a species and how far we might go. And this feeling, because honestly, that's what all it really is, has helped me to remain hopeful through all the various disasters and tragedies that I've seen or witnessed or lived through in my life, and also in the face of all of the pretty frightening what ifs that are looming over our future. Things like climate change, nuclear war, you name it. However, I've never really understood why I felt that way or why I feel this way, because I still do. It's always been a little bit of a mystery to me. I had this feeling, but I never really knew where it came from. And for a long time, I've thought about trying to figure out where it did come from, trying to track it down and write about it. But I never did, which is kind of ironic because I spent most of my adult life um, pursuing a career as a writer, first as a journalist and then as a writer of fiction. But I never really tracked it down. During that time, the world around me became a lot more pessimistic. Back in the late 90s, um, this country, and I think the world in general, was feeling pretty good about the future. We defeated the USSR and communism in the Cold War, and millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, were freer to live the world the way that they wanted to. Um, Countries were becoming democratic all over the world. And also, maybe even more important, people were climbing out of poverty. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of people were finding better lives for themselves and their families. So there was definitely a sense of optimism about where we might go in the future. So then fast forward about 20 years, and certainly in this country, and with some exceptions, I would say around the world, the optimism has kind of faded. It's still there in places, but I think for the most part, this is not a very optimistic time. Weirdly, however, the feeling that I had, which I've had this whole time, this feeling of optimism and hope about the future, it didn't go away. Didn't budge at all. And it was the contrast between this change that I saw around me, especially in my country, from being an optimistic place to being a very pessimistic and anxious place. that led me to decide that I really should try and figure out where this feeling came from, right? Because if there's some secret reason to be positive, in my subconscious, now is the time to figure it out. Also, at the time I was expecting my first child, and that experience gave me a new sort of sense of responsibility for the world. And I thought, well, what can I do to help make sure that the world that he inherits is a decent place to live in? And one of the things I thought of was writing about this feeling that I had that I still didn't totally understand. So I did. The result was the book, The After Age. The subtitle is Why We're Going to Be Okay and How You Can Help Us to Be Great. And this video, along with the videos that follow, are essentially the contents of that book in a video lecture form. So if you would like to read the book, there's a link in the show notes, or you can just keep watching the videos. It's fine with me. So I'm not a historian or an economist or a psychologist or a sociologist or anthropologist. I have no profession. Well, I have no profession that would give me the kind of professional insight into the state of the world that you might expect from a book like that or from a video like that. I hesitate a little bit with that because as a writer, theoretically, that is part of my job, is trying to understand the world around me. But I'll leave that as is. All I wanted to do was to figure out why I had this optimistic feeling despite myself. I'm not an optimist. I'm a skeptic. Honestly, I'm a cynic sometimes, too much sometimes. But I had this optimistic feeling and I didn't understand where it came from. And I assumed that it was about progress, right? Material progress. All the stuff you read about in school, Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and, the discovery of disease, disease germ theory of medicine, whatever, vaccination, so on, so on, so on. All this great progress and science that we have achieved over the last 300 or 500 years. And it's kind of about that. But what I learned writing the book is that the feeling that I had is more about the relationship between us as individuals and as members of different groups and all that progress. About how we understand it and how we incorporate it into our lives and into the relationships that we have with each other. So as a result, the book and these videos, they kind of cross a lot of boundaries that normally aren't crossed. And by that I mean the boundaries between, what is subjective experience, your personal experience of the world, and what is the sort of big picture experience of the world. What matters to the individual and what matters to groups of people or nations. And the idea that maybe those things are all kind of connected, or even that the boundaries between them don't really matter that much or aren't really relevant, or at the very least need to be redrawn, I guess. I also learned something about optimism writing this book. It obviously has a pretty optimistic title. What I learned again, as someone who's not an optimist, is that optimism is not necessarily knowing that everything is going to turn out great. It can also be having the confidence that whatever happens, including really terrible things, that you will be able to deal with it. So as a result, this book is less about why we're going to be okay and more about how we can be great. It's about the how, because knowing the how is how you gain that confidence to take on whatever's coming. So that's basically the preface to this book and this series of videos. Next, I'm going to talk about, I'm going to provide an example of why we're going to be okay and how we could be great. And it's a probably somewhat controversial example. At the very least, it's not the first thing you would think of when trying to prove that things are going great. I hope you will join me for that video, and thanks for watching.